Hello, Indy. How are you this morning?
Good morning. I'm really well. I'm delighted and honored to be here. So delighted to have this time with you,
Yeah,
which I'm really honored to be part of.
we've asked Indy to spend 10 minutes helping us understand the concept of civic capital and how that way of thinking might help speed up the transition. So we look very much forward to that.
Thank you, and I'll speed this into it because it's actually quite a lot to get through, and I'm going to try to do it as quickly as I can in that process. So, firstly, I will make slides available so that they can be seen and understood later. But I will try to go through this as relatively quickly as I can, just to make the point, and then we can. Obviously, as a member, I'm happy to help and go into deeper conversations around any of these issues. As was being said, this is part of a larger piece of work which we're doing in Canada around building civic capital, which is looking at how do we finance and look at civic goods in the 21st century. It involves various organizations from McConnell Foundation to Mars and various other people, Future Cities Canada, a whole cluster of organizations. I want to talk about the need, and I will do this very, very quickly. Obviously, the need is massive. Everyone knows what kind of climate change issues are, yet we still have an issue of how do we construct a democratic viability around it. And it's kind of, but it's really clear there's a real issue to deal with our common goods and our common infrastructures and our common risks. And those common risks all the way go to in terms of actually obviously climate change, but also look at human development and education systems, also to do with actually the indirect effects, which is flooding and other structural issues. We also know the kind of, in a way, the collective risks which are accumulating in these issues, whether it's heat waves and other effects are happening. But also, we need to recognize that most of what we've got sorted and addressed is a very small part of the transition that's required. So if you look at the average fin, which has 10 tons worth of carbon consumption and production, you realize that actually just by doing all the things that we think are good, we still have a lot of white space left of all the things that need to be done to get to some of the targets that we've already signed up to. And those targets are not even extreme targets. They're actually the targets that we talk about. Key things when you look at these sort of changes, and I think Viable Cities has really been thinking about this quite hard, is in order to make some of these transitions, you have to be able to deal with what I would call the whole value chain transition. So one of the things that's really clear when you talk about transitions, increasingly we have to find financial mechanisms, investment mechanisms, which aren't focused on single products, but the whole value chain. How do we finance that? How do we transition that? I think is really critical. And places like Gothenburg, I think, have been used as an example, certainly in our conversations through Viable Cities, as being able to sort of piecemeal some of this stuff together. And now we need to do it intentionally. Second, I think it's really critical to recognize is the rise of intangible goods and the value of intangible assets in this new economy. And I think civic assets actually create huge amounts of intangible value, which is non-directly realized. And I think that our ability to finance and understand non-intangible assets, intangible public assets, is going to be really critical. And I think it's one of the real issues that we face is we don't have a viable financing mechanism to look at that. And a good example of that is a tree in a street is a liability for the government, for the state, because actually the insurance costs and the maintenance costs are what I accounted for, but the environmental services are not really accounted for, and nor is it understood in terms of the mitigation of liabilities that it brings. So there's a really critical issue, and we can also talk about health and education not being on the balance sheets of governments, means that it's very difficult to invest and drive some of that. So there's a really big question about intangibles. What there is also is where that value of intangibles is historically being captured is in land and associated assets. Land is where these intangible assets are being effectively indirectly captured. And I think you can see that this is the net wealth graph of the UK. And you see land as being the big driver of big holder of wealth in the process of a greater move towards an intangible economy. And I think that's worth recognizing. And this thesis of spillover is very critical to understanding civic goods and civic value, where you can make an investment in one location, but the value return spills over in multiple ways. And I'll give some real examples of this. And unless we can understand the spillover value, there's a really interesting question about how we invest in civic goods. And historically, we've invested in civic goods because cities and nation states have had business models and value models, which are basically saying we will invest and we will capture returns indirectly, non-directly, longitudinally. And increasingly, that's becoming more and more difficult, as to do with both the politics and precision of investing, how we choose and how we allocate that risk. So at this same time, what we do know is that civic investment is vital. And there are lots of good examples through history. And if you go back to the Great Fire of London in 1666, which gave birth to the insurance industry, it was the insurance industry which gave birth, in turn, to the fire brigade service. So the public service known as fire brigade was really funded and founded by the insurance industry, because the insurance industry crystallized future risk. When you crystallize future risk, you can do preventative intervention to manage that risk. That is a really looking at public risk and being able to and invest against them. There's a really fantastic example called Reef Capital, which basically aggregated the flooding risk of a coastal landscape in Mexico, insured all the properties, and in turn did the mitigation to actually support the reef and rejuvenate the reef that lowered the risk of flooding to the properties on the beach. So what you see is here was the crystallization of that risk by insuring it, and then the mitigation process of restoring that reef. And that was non-linear investment to be able to do that. Our ability to construct these models and these business models is increasing, which I think is the real key part of that value transition. The High Line is a really great example. I'll talk about this a little bit more. High Line in New York create massive amounts of private value as a result of actually what it did. I mean, so just to give you an idea, just 10% of the uplift value of land associated to the High Line, 10% would have paid for the whole High Line in under 10 months. So civic goods create, not only do they manage future risks, they also create huge spillover values. How do you build the value models to be able to understand that? And these things can be associated with all the way from parks, schools, sort of stations, which is often used, that all these civic goods create an uplift value. And how do we create more tighter value models which link these things in real terms to who the beneficiaries are? And I'll talk a little bit around it. We've done the work around modeling the High Line effect, as we call it, looking at the kind of land value increase and what the implications were, and also then starting to construct a covenant which links the land value uplift to associated those civic goods and starts to pay for them in the long term. And this is what we're calling a smart commons. Now, why I talk about this kind of discrete value model for public good is really critical in us being able to not only build civic goods, but also manage civic risks in multiple formats. And we can do this in multiple ways. And we've been building some of the technology out in terms of actually looking at how does this link to smart title deeds, covenants, geospatial data, also the construction of the voting infrastructure like a business improvement district, which allows people to vote for these transactions. How do you understand the land value differentiation? How do you appropriately manage that? And then constructing that contract. Now, this sounds crazy, but the reality is this was all done in the 19th century by the Boston Parks Trust in the US, which now has 1.9 billion in its foundation, because it built parks and built housing next to those parks and took 10% of their uplift value and invested in, which returned back to the park. And the Parks Trust has then been creating more and more parks. So we've got historic examples of covenants which link private value and civic value together. It's our ability to now be able to construct these with digital technologies allows us to be able to construct whole new civic value contracts. And that applies all the way through to forests. Again, what you see with urban forests, we're seeing a huge amount of push to urban forests. We're working literally around the world, from Madrid to other locations, to Montreal, around how do you build and finance urban forests. Many cities are recognizing the need for them in terms of managing heat island effects and various other things. It's very difficult to finance. Again, what we're looking at is not the tree itself, but the services the tree provides and the impacts the tree provides and trees provide who are the beneficiaries, and they can be all the way from land value on that street to sustainable urban drainage and the reduction of actually need for new sewers, to the reduction of heat island effects, which requires peak load energy demand to be reduced. So you start to construct whole new value models around these public assets and start to construct different ways of financing that. So the thesis that we're running in the civic capital work is that these civic goods create huge amount of value, and we now have the technology to be able to construct new value models for those new publics. I use the word publics as in plural, and our ability to finance them in particular, rather than agglomerate financing, which has historically been the case, either through direct underwriting or other formats. And that's really opens up a whole conversation. And this is really to deal with the large infrastructure investments cities need. And I mean large. So if you want to plant 1 million trees in the city, say, for example, which say Milan wants to do, you're talking upwards of 400 million euros. So we're talking large scale infrastructure scale investment, which is going to be in this space, and an unwillingness and an inability to leverage the existing balance sheets, which are either over completely stacked up, and no ability to unmonetizable underlying assets, which where we currently the benefits to trees aren't understood, or other social goods. So unless we can do this, and most people recognize the problem is not raising money. The problem is actually building the value model to return money. So it's not that there's lots of free money out there. The question is actually, how do we make sure we can service that money in really radical formats? And that's where actually the innovation really needs to be, in terms of looking at future-oriented financing, the democratization of that financing in terms of actually who can invest, but also the transparency of those models, the radical transparency of those finance and contractual flows to be able to recognize and ensure governance, but fundamentally financing systems. So a tree is not an individual object, but it's a system of value, and recognizing those system futures. I will end very quickly, but I just wanted to say we've been doing some work with high net worth individuals across Europe. And what's fascinating to say is, if this was a question we asked them, if you're investing in a 100-year bond, what would you invest in? It was education, health, natural ecosystems, agriculture. Now, fascinating to say that this is where their focus was in terms of their top 4 answers. I find that interesting, that actually when you're looking for long-term investment, it is these infrastructures that actually hold residual value. And then the second point is, when you were asking them for investment for impact theory for high net worth individuals across Europe, they were saying they would invest to shape sectors, whole value chains, invest to shape markets, invest to shape societies. Investment in products was as low as possible. So what is really interesting is increasingly the next generation of high net worth individuals and money flow is biasing towards a certain type of thinking, which I think across Europe, which I think is really fascinating. And finally, which I think is a real structural asset of Sweden and many of the Scandinavian and Nordic countries, is that what societies would you invest in for long-term returns? It is deep democracies. So actually, if we want to make ourselves fit for 21st century investment, it is the building and the investment of our deep democracy, which will be vital for long-term investment. And I think that is a really critical asset that I think Sweden has and needs to be leveraged in terms of the fitness ratio to deal with complex risks in societies. So under this, we're building a lot of stuff, including perpetual bonds, which a colleague of mine, Anastasia, is working on, and looking at these sort of perpetual investment models, perpetual smart bonds, and various other things, which are linked to understanding these goods as civic assets. So one of those examples is a house. So we're prototyping a house called a free house, which is financed through a perpetual bond, and the house itself becomes a smart public trust. And instead of us being an owner or a renter, we're in treaty, we're a steward of the house, which starts to transform our relationship into those environments. It's a new type of public house, but it's about public, not in being state-owned, but actually a new form of civic housing in that format. And this is where technology can create some of those infrastructures around that thesis. Thank you. I hope I've not gone on too long, but I hope that gives you a quick flavor as to thinking.
Thank you
Let's
so
stop
thank you
this.
so much, Indy. I think that was a firestorm of interesting ideas and concepts. And for those of you who sort of got lost early on trying to scribble whatever you were saying, we will share this presentation for close study with those who want. And I think that this is a very interesting idea. It's basically the civic capital, if I understand you correctly here, it's sort of what gets measured gets done. And then it's sort of the more on a high level concept. So do we value what gets measured? And what gives value is something that we do measure. And do I understand you correctly? That's a good starting point if you're a Swedish city wanting to sort of put this into practice, to start asking yourself that sort of high level question.
And also recognizing that many of the things that you do intuitively create value, and they create spillover value for everyone else. So I'm not particularly interested in, SORI or other impact measures. What I'm really interested in is where does the value go, and who is the beneficiary. And the beneficiary can be uplift, private uplift, or it can be the reduction of risk. But there is a beneficiary, and I think that conversation about understanding beneficiaries means that we can construct new value models for civic assets, because we know that they're critical. We know they create value. Increasingly, they create massive amounts of value, as we discovered with the High Line. I mean, unbelievable amounts of value. The best investment deal that you could have ever done would have been to invest in the High Line if you were able to capture the land uplift value in some portion. So we know civics create value. We know they're critical to our collective survival. I think that the question is, where are the beneficiaries, who are the risk holders, and how do we build a new compact? And I think the technology is now allowing us to not only measure that, but also be dynamically be able to contract that value. That, I think, is a paradigm leap to create the new civics. And I think the new civics are fundamental for democracy in terms of actually our ability as Europe to be able to build that democratic contract and arrangement format.
Because I'm thinking it's also sort of I'm associating it with sort of Mariana Mazzucato's ideas on sort of how value comes from public goods. I mean, she's been very vocal in pointing out this, how government, for example, saved companies like Tesla, but then didn't gain any profit from that as an investment, rather than just acting as a bank and not sort of correctly appreciating the value they provided to that company in the long term.
Exactly. And I think what I'm trying to get to, why I use the word radical civics in this financing thesis, is that this doesn't necessarily just have to be the state. It is the idea of public good can be constructed in lots of different parts. So the city is a function of the publics, not necessarily just the state. But the role of state is to construct the right relationships and to construct the frameworks. And I think that is really revolutionary. I think this is where we can construct. And I think what's really come out over the last 10 years, last year, for me, is really clearly how Sweden has understood democracy in a really deep way. And I think that is a massive strength. The question is, how do we build the economic structures for deep democracy? And how do we understand these these publics, the tree as a public agent of good, whilst could be privately financed, or independently financed, not even privately financed, but it's a public trust with public provision. So our ability to democratize the capacity to drive that is going to be really vital, because the balance sheets of Swedish cities and other cities aren't going to be able to take this. So this requires a revolution in how we think about both governance and financing of civics. And PPP and stuff like that doesn't work, doesn't take us to this future.
No. Thank you so much for sharing those thoughts, Indy. And thank you for joining us this morning. Det där var alltså Indy Johar som är grundare av Dark Matter Labs, som är en av våra lite mer än 80 medlemmar i Viable Cities.